Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to interrupt your wonderful conversations. I'm sure that there is a lot going on at the tables, but we do have a program, and we don't want to keep you longer than we stipulated in the program. We have a keynote speaker that I have the pleasure to introduce, if I can find his bio here in the program. But let me take a moment first to thank Pablo de la Peña from the Tec de Monterrey. Thank you very much for this great partnership on this project. And also Oscar Lugo as well. Can't find it, but here he is. Thank you very much, from the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. And of course, Verónica Vaz from CIDAC, the Center for Research on Development in Mexico City. And of course, my colleague and friend from the Center for U.S. and Mexican Law, Steven Zamora. I think the five of us have worked very, very hard to put this project together, and I think we have certainly enjoyed this program this morning. And we got our keynote today, and we have one more panel on really important issues this afternoon: security and social issues that may emerge from the implementation of energy reform. But for now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alejandro Ponce. Dr. Ponce is the Chief Research Officer of the World Justice Project. He joined the World Justice Project as a senior economist and is now one of the original designers and a lead author of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. Earlier in his career, he worked as a researcher at Yale University and an economist at the World Bank and the Mexican Banking and Securities Commission. Dr. Ponce has been a speaker in numerous international forums, and his work has been published in peer-reviewed journals and featured in the popular press. He holds a BA in economics from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, and an MA and a PhD in economics from Stanford University. Alejandro, welcome to the Baker Institute.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today, just talking about these very important topics. It's my first time here at Rice University, and I'm enjoying it very much. Let me just begin perhaps by summarizing a little bit some of the things that we have heard. Without really going into detail, I think that we all recognize that Mexico needed an energy reform, and that the reform was a big step in achieving the full potential that Mexico has with its energy resources. However, what we have heard as well is, during all the morning and in the afternoon, are the many challenges that actually this reform possesses. This reform presents a lot of challenges, and my presentation, I want to take again this 10,000 feet perspective that we heard in the morning when we were hearing the keynote of Luis Rubio on the rule of law challenges that the energy presents. And first, I want to start my presentation by looking at this from the perspective of an investor. Yes, we know that the reform has a great potential for increasing investment, for increasing productivity, for increasing output. So let's think for a moment as an investor. So what is an investor seeing in the conditions that we are seeing in the country? Just the legal conditions, the institutional conditions, and so on. So since I'm not an investor, just in order to think as an investor, I actually have to just look at the most important source, just where we get all the questions about investment and so on, right? So, and essentially an investor wants to maximize the return on investment, which is just the expected profit minus the expenses or the costs. Now, when we think about this, just imagine that you're trying to invest in this sector in Mexico. And you have to think about all the different institutional features of the country that you cannot necessarily change, but you have to face on a daily basis. You have to face a state that may or may not necessarily follow the law, just a state that binds society, some certain laws that actually bind just the behavior of the society, and that essentially translate into issues such as what happens if someone breaks the law. So if someone breaks the law, is it possible that that person is punished or not? So if there is a corrupt official and I'm asked for a bribe, what do I have to do? Should I pay? Should I not pay? Should I denounce? What happens if I denounce? When I'm actually trying to build a pipeline, so what are the security risks that I have to face? So these are the kind of questions that investors are thinking and that are important just in thinking of the full potential of the energy reform that goes beyond all the legal framework that we have discussed. So that's the key question. The key question is how all these features are going to affect investment, and it's really very, very hard to know how they are going to affect. We know that they are going to have an effect, but just to quantify that effect is extremely difficult. And what comes to mind was, when thinking about this, was just a picture of me just last week. I was on vacation with my wife in Punta del Este, and suddenly we were just trying to get into the beach, and she told me, let me just go back to the car because I forgot my cell phone. And then that's me with the towels, the diaper bag, then the beach bag, then a toddler that wanted to dig the largest hole in the beach, and a baby just trying to reach out to the guy who was renting the umbrellas, right? So unfortunately, there's no picture because my wife forgot the cell phone in the car, but that's me, right? So you can imagine actually how that looked. And I eventually reached out to the guy, but it took me much longer. So it's the same thing with this. So what is the effect that all the situations that we're facing in the country, all the institutional conditions that we face in Mexico, how are they going to affect the investment and the full potential of the energy reform? It's hard to tell, but we know that we're not going to get to the guy renting the umbrellas as fast as we would like. So with this, in the end, we know that these are manifestations of the lack of rule of law. And rather than going with definitions of the rule of law, I'm just trying to put something that goes beyond the legalistic definitions that we sometimes hear. And that I like because it is helpful to thinking about, or it was very helpful in thinking of a framework that we developed to actually try to conceptualize the rule of law. So the rule of law limits and defines the power of government, and it allows government to limit the actions of various members of society. So at its core, the rule of law is about checks and balances between society and a state. That's what it is. So let me just present, just keeping this in mind, how can we just translate this into something that is much more actionable, something that we can think about in reforming and in changing the incentives of people, in actually seeing that we as investors or we as people see outcomes that benefit us all. So just for this, I'm just trying to present something. When we developed the Rule of Law Index, a mental cartoon, if you want, that I think it's very useful to think about this topic. Just imagine that we are in a desert island, and suddenly we want to found a new nation. And so some people are going to say, we actually need some sticks because we're going to face some dangers in the island. And we say, okay, so we're going to hand out these sticks to these people who are suddenly going to be the guardians, right, and are going to be the government. And they say, yes, we're going to use these to protect you. Just we're going to protect the entire society. So just we're the only ones who are going to keep the sticks. We're the only ones who are going to control the violence, and since we're the only ones that we're going to control the violence, we're also going to put in place some mechanisms in case there are disputes between you, so that disputes can be resolved in a peaceful manner, and if someone actually breaks some of the rules, that we can come together, just that there is some sort of punishment for that person, right? So then that government is going to be in charge of security, that government is going to be in charge of providing justice to the inhabitants of the island, and obviously, we're going to put some rules as well, just to avoid conflict at any time, so they are going to also to be in charge of enforcing these rules. In exchange, the people of the island say, well, that's fine, but if you're going to hold all the sticks, then you're going to be held accountable, right? So if that's the case, we're not going to give all the sticks to the same guy. We're going to try to distribute the stick among different people. Then, since you have the sticks and you're going to actually just collect some funds, we're going to check that you're not stealing the funds. We're going to check that you don't use the sticks to come and hit us. And we're going to check that you actually, in deciding all the processes, you invite us to participate and to be part of this together, so that we all govern together. So that basic idea, just this is what we have here in the rule of law factors, which is just constraints on government power, absence of corruption, open government and fundamental rights as checks on the government, and then as duties of the government, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. I'm going to use this framework to present some figures about the current situation that Mexico is facing in terms of rule of law, just to help us understand a little bit just the challenges that, again, investors may be facing when trying to invest in the country. And let's just try to think only about the big investors, but just this reform is touching a large number of people and a large number of firms, right, which go to macro, just major firms, to micro enterprises that are going to be engaged in the chain of value of the energy sector. So just when we develop this index, just one of the things that we look at is, once we have these elements of the rule of law, we have to look into more detail into these features. So for instance, when we talk about civil justice, what exactly do we mean by that? Just when a society, as people just demanding justice, what is what we demand? Just we demand that the civil justice is accessible, that it's efficient, that it's effective, that it's enforceable, that doesn't discriminate. Those are the kind of features that we look. When we look at fundamental rights, we look about different freedoms, we look about no discrimination, and so on. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I think it's useful just to keep in mind that this goes beyond just simply this aggregate category. What we have done with this framework, I'm going to present some numbers here, is trying to measure the rule of law in many different countries. And for doing this, the exercise that we engaged, we consulted a lot of people to try to understand how the rule of law can be applied, or how it applies in different countries. And if you see from what we saw before, at the end what we are looking at are different outcomes, regardless of the different means that countries use to achieve them. So one of them can be the law, the legal framework, but it's only one of them. There are many other things that are necessary in order to see no corruption, or in order to see that people can access justice effectively. So we need capacity, we need people, we need resources, we need incentives, and so on. So in the end, what we're going to be looking at are just simply these ends or outcomes that make up the rule of law. In building this exercise, we have engaged just I mean, if we really want to know how people experience the rule of law, we have to go and ask them. So for this exercise, we have basically interviewed 100,000 people around the world, and approximately 2,500 lawyers every year for the last 4 years in 102 countries. We asked about 500 questions on how they perceive and experience different outcomes, just such as they had to pay a bribe, or just for legal practitioners, just what's their experience when they go to courts, either criminal or commercial courts. The data is available on the web, but these are some of the pictures of the people that we have actually interviewed in different countries around the world. This is from Mexico. Let me just go into the picture that we have found in Mexico. So just forget about the radar graph at the left. It's a little bit messy so I don't want to focus on that. But first, when we look at the rule of law as a whole, when we look at all the elements, what we see, if you see the global rank of Mexico is 79 out of 102 countries. So, which, if we compare even with countries at the same level of economic development, just Mexico ranks 28 out of 31 countries that are upper middle income countries. We're comparing Mexico here with Brazil, with Argentina, with Turkey. And in Latin America, 14 out of 19. The overall score is 0.47. And then we can go deeper into each one of the elements that make up the index. And I want to pay attention to three things, which is that I'm going to talk about in the rest of the time that I have, which are corruption, justice, and security, which are three of the largest challenges that the country faces and that anyone investing in energy or in anything just face. So let me just start with corruption and show you some pictures. Some are coming from the data that I just showed, but some others are just simply just from the general press. This is just the Index of Transparency International, 95 out of 168 countries in corruption. This is a question, for example, that we ask to each one of the people that answers the questionnaire. It's a simple scenario. What happens if the Environmental Protection Authority in Mexico notifies a plant that is polluting the river? Which outcome is the most likely? Only 16% of people think that the company is going to comply with the law. 62% of people in Mexico say that the company is going to bribe or influence the authorities. And 22 say that absolutely nothing happens. Just when we compare actually with other figures, unfortunately I don't have the graph here, but it's one of the lowest. This one is from the World Bank Enterprise Survey. This is just the percentage of companies that experience at least one bribery solicitation in the last 12 months. This is data from 2013. Mexico, 17%, much higher than the rest of Latin American countries or upper middle income countries. This is from the World Economic Forum. The most problematic factors to doing business in Mexico: corruption and crime at the top. Just much higher than tax regulations, capacity, and so on. According to the World Bank, 9% of the GDP is lost to corruption. Just to give you a sense, the oil revenues of Mexico represent 6% of the GDP. So this is still much higher. This actually came this week. It's a note from El País saying that actually 53% of government officials do not want to declare whether they have a conflict of interest. And obviously, there is pressure from everyone. I think the Mexican society in general is fed up of this. This is just Juan Pablo Castañón from the Consejo Coordinador Empresarial, just asking reforms against corruption. And in general, the society is doing stuff. This is just something very recent. Just the initiative that it has been proposed by civil society, 3 of 3, just to fight corruption. But I think, I want to talk a little bit about what are the challenges in fighting corruption. Because part of the problem is that in the energy sector, there are a lot of opportunities for corruption at all different levels. We know that. And we can end up just all this reform, if we don't necessarily address the issues of corruption, is not going to solve it by itself. We can end up just in a situation like Petrobras that we have seen. So I think there are two key things that are necessary for this. So the first one is a legal framework, and I want to talk about two things. So the first one is, I think, in terms of the legal framework, a very important component that we have heard recently in the previous panels is transparency. In general, Mexico has a commitment toward transparency. Just there are some, there are laws that are just that when they were developed, were some of the most innovative laws in terms of transparency. Mexico is now the chair, or was the chair, of the Open Government Partnership, which is a multi-stakeholder commitment to open government and transparency. Mexico, as we have been hearing, it's also just trying to become part of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and is indeed one of the commitments that Mexico has done in the Open Government Partnership. So there is a commitment to transparency to a certain extent. Just there are part of the problem, however, is that transparency is not enough. Just even though we have, for instance, just round one, just we have heard that just it was quite transparent. The framework that we currently have is shaky, because transparency it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So if we know that there are corrupt officers, but there are no legal instruments or political will to actually prosecute them, just nothing happens. It's just another headline. So then it's just the first part. It's useful. It's useful to create confidence. It's useful to build credibility. It's useful for the civil society to know what's happening, but it's not enough. So just understanding this, Mexico has also engaged in building an anti-corruption system that essentially has set up just the legal architecture to fighting corruption. However, it's still incomplete. So the initiative that we saw, the previous slide that I mentioned, is just an effort to actually push forward on this reform, on building just the secondary laws that are necessary to actually fighting corruption. And just let me just mention something. I mean, we have heard a little bit about some comments that Mexico has strong laws, but what is missing is enforcement. I think, that I agree with a large part of that comment, but I don't think that we have, in many of these instances, we have as strong laws as we think. Just 3 weeks ago, there was an article in Reforma by Juan Pardinas, who is the director of IMCO. And in that article, he mentioned some very interesting statistics about just whether states can actually prosecute certain corruption acts or not. And one that I have here that is very interesting is, for instance, in 25 states, it is possible to be released on bail for illegal enrichment. So, and he mentioned several of those cases that make us think that indeed we don't have strong laws, at least in this particular part of corruption, as we think. So I think that is what the legal framework that has been constructed together with as part of the anti-corruption system it will have to deal with many of these issues. So the second one, obviously, has to do with the enforcement of the laws that indeed require a political will to fight corruption that sometimes we do not necessarily see in Mexico. Let me just show you some other data. This is coming from just a ranking that we have as part of the Rule of Law Index on impunity. It's composed of about 30 questions on the likelihood that corrupt officials or officials in the government who break the law are going to be prosecuted. Mexico actually ranks 96 out of 102 countries. This is just, for instance, a similar question to the one that I showed you before. Assume that as a result of an audit, a local government officer is found to be unlawfully issuing a government license for personal benefit. Which one is most likely? Just only 13% of people think that the official is going to be prosecuted and punished. So this number is one of the lowest of the 102 countries that we survey. And part of the problem is just not necessarily not only the laws, but again, as I was saying, just the lack of political will to prosecute. In October, we had a breakfast with the Tsar of the UK, the anti-corruption Tsar of the UK, and some Mexican businessmen. And one of the Mexican businessmen said, you know, the problem is that you don't understand how things work in Mexico. Because just in Mexico, corruption is part of the culture. So, and we have heard that argument before. And what he answered was just, the problem is that Mexico doesn't punish corruption. And he mentioned this old mafia proverb, punish one, teach 100. So that's part of the problem. This political will obviously has to translate into building a system that effectively just fights corruption, prosecutes corruption, punishes corruption, and so on. Let me just show you, just for instance, this is the Anti-Corruption Agency of Hong Kong. Just in September, I was invited to Hong Kong to the agency. It was a fascinating experience just learning how just such a tiny jurisdiction just is committed to actually fighting corruptions and the amount of resources that they have to fight corruption. So they have about 2,500 people fighting corruption. Just out of those, about 1,500 just prosecuting and investigating corrupt acts. They have just hotlines, websites, just different avenues for everyone in the country to actually complain about corruption. So this is obviously something that we don't have in Mexico. We don't have still 2,500 people fighting corruption, and not only prosecuting and punishing corruption, but just trying to find the opportunities, just try to find the loopholes that people use, right? They try to build, just we heard in the morning about building this anti-corruption culture. Just one of the things that they gave me was a series of DVDs of the equivalent of telenovelas, just which I watched only a couple of episodes just on my way back. And I mean, it's just very small things that you will think, just me, I have to confess, as a Mexican, will say, well, probably we're going to, just this was a situation of a mother that had to just engage in a corrupt act just to actually get milk for their child. And me as a Mexican actually thought, well, you know, probably they are going to, in the end, just they are going to forgive her or something like that. No, just the person, actually just the novella, it finished that the person was actually going to be prosecuted. So it's just this culture of fighting corruption, no matter whether it's big or small. So it's just engaging into building this culture. So which I think we're still a little bit far from building. Just one of the key things, for example, just that we don't have is the cost of corruption, just the cost of engaging in corrupt acts, the social cost of engaging in corrupt acts. Just still society do not necessarily punishes just those who engage in corrupt acts. It's not necessarily seen as bad as we think. So this is something that everyone needs to, that we all as society need to improve. The second point that I want to mention is the administration of justice. This is part, again, of some of the questionnaires that we ask, and this is just coming from the surveys that we ask to commercial lawyers. What you can see, this is very simple. Blue is better, and darker blue is even better. And red is bad, and darker red is worse. Just you can see the Mexico is not at the top, and we see as well some of the issues that the country is facing: duration of cases, inefficient enforcement mechanisms that we all know, corruption, and so on. This is just thinking about access to justice. What are the most important problems that people trying to access courts face? And again, Mexico doesn't necessarily rank at the top, but we see, for instance, court fees are not an issue, but just the duration of cases, biases, procedures, and so on are some of the main problems that the country is facing. Why is this important in the context of energy reform? So for two reasons. So one is just we as thinking as an investor, just obviously in creating value, just we're going to face a lot of possible conflicts, just with suppliers, with authorities, with labor, with the employees, and so on. And we will need mechanisms to actually resolve these disputes. So we have heard some alternative mechanisms that can be built, but this is the day-to-day thing that many of the different firms are going to face, right? The system is in transition towards improving, because we know that something, that part of the reform, that there is a reform process toward moving to oral trials and so on, but we're still not there, and we're still facing some of these issues that they will have to face. The second one is not necessarily as entrepreneurs, but affects entrepreneurs, which is the fact that people in the country do not necessarily have access to justice. So what we see in Mexico is that if I have a problem, the most likely thing that will happen is that I will go and protest or block the road rather than trying to take the government to court. Just try to look for political solutions rather than institutional solutions. Right? And this is in part because the system is not accessible to the general public, right? Just in the context of the energy reform that we have been discussing, just we have heard about many of the potential conflicts that may arise because of the reform. We were listening about the water, some of the water issues. So what's going to happen when these problems materialize? So what are the resources that people are going to use? The last one is security. So for security, this is not news to anybody. This is some statistics that we put just from, this is from INEGI, 22.8 million people were victims of a crime. So that's the population of New Zealand and Australia together. 33% of firms were victims of at least one crime, and in many cases they were serious crimes, just not necessarily shoplifting, but just kidnapping and so on. Obviously, this is going to increase the cost of investing in the country. We know that violent crime has negative effects on the aggregate economic activity, and the effects actually go beyond just deterring investment, but actually also changing the structure, the economic structure of the country, reducing economic complexity. So, just what do we do to fight just insecurity? We know that the criminal justice system, this is again data from the World Justice Project, ranks among some of the worst in the country, and we know that this is something that Mexico right now is dealing with. We have heard a lot of different proposals for dealing with this problem. And I want to mention some that were mentioned by Joaquín Villalobos in a conference of Coparmex. Joaquín Villalobos was a former guerrilla fighter. He had just like 10,000 people in charge of him. He's from El Salvador. And he's an expert on security. And he mentioned some, I think, some things that are very interesting to think when thinking about the issue of security in Mexico. So the first one is that the strategies to fight violence have to be accord to the nature of the problem. So the nature of the problem is huge in Mexico. So if the problem is national, you will need national strategies. For some other things, the problem is local, you will need local strategies. Second, investing in security is an investment. It's not an expenditure, it's an investment. And just to give you an idea, Mexico currently is spending 1% of the GDP. Colombia, just that had the problem with the guerrillas and the cartels, was expending 6% of the GDP in fighting crime. The strategies, they have to be accord to the problem. So there are essentially three types of strategies, just punitive strategies, dissuasive, and social. So a lot of the strategies are to dissuade or to prevent crime from happening, right? I'm not going to start just a low cholesterol diet when I have a heart attack. Just if I have a heart attack, I need to go to the hospital and deal with the heart attack. So that is one of the things that need to be dealt. And obviously, just for dealing with this problem, it's necessary to have a very strong police force, but a strong police force that is capable of fighting the crime, but also that respects human rights. We heard a comment in the morning about this duality, for instance, of presumed guilty and the war on drugs. I think it's key just to keep that human right component in the discussion. It cannot be, it's essentially what separates police from criminal, the good from the bad, Batman from the Joker. So it's key, and it's key because it helps to build trust, and trust is one of the most important things in fighting security. Just it helps with intelligence. Intelligence is not gathered just as we see in CSI, just through sophisticated methods. The most important source of intelligence are people. And if you don't have the trust of the people, you're never going to succeed in fighting crime, right? But also, we have to be aware that police officers are people. And in thinking about this reform, we have to just keep them at the core of the discussion. Because sometimes just police officers they definitely do not have the trust of the people, and not everyone is the same. Most of them are good people, the same way that most government officials are not corrupt and are good people. So we need to include all of them into the discussions. In conclusion, I think that the rule of law obviously is key for any success that the energy reform is going to have. I think at the same time, I think that the crisis presents an opportunity, and the challenge is huge. It's transformative. It's transforming a new country. But I think the reward is going to be huge. So even though we see all the situation and so on, I think that the country is moving, and I want to finish just presenting an optimistic view. I think that we all are working on this, right? But I think that in order to succeed, this has to be a multi-stakeholder effort. It's not going to succeed only with political parties working on it or only with civil society. Everyone has to work on it through the means that they have at their hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you. We have perhaps time for one, maybe two very pressing quick questions, if anybody really. It's kind of shocking to see a cop who says, "I don't trust the police," but it kind of sums it all up. Yes. Anybody else after that, very quickly? Okay, go please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for such an interesting chat, and of course the police talk is shocking. But I wanted to ask you about maybe a very important topic. What's your opinion on education? And the reason is because you may know that last year the president asked CIDE, the university where I work, to make a diagnosis on what was called justicia cotidiana, like they say, everyday justice or justice for the layman. No? And what we found there is that people do not use the courts because they don't know they have the right to use the courts. They don't know they have rights. For 70 years, government always told them that these are gifts that your government gives you, school, water, health. So the first thing is that we have a lot of ignorance about having rights, how to defend human rights, and that the courts are there for you. The next problem is that they are very complex, sometimes expensive, But what was really amazing was that most people, laymen, don't know that these things are not gifts from government, but that they are their rights and that they are entitled to defending them. So I would like to know, what's your impression on that? And
yes, I absolutely agree, and I share your concern as well. Obviously, this is something that needs to be, it's the most basic thing, right? Just that people know, and they don't necessarily need to know everything, but at least they need to know the basic things. At least they need to know that they have certain rights, that they can look for information. They may not necessarily know where the court is or what the procedures are, but they need to know just that they actually have the right to go, and if they want, that they can look for information, that there are sources for legal aid just in order to help them. I agree with you that this is something that needs to be done. I think there are some very interesting efforts to try to introduce this. This has to be done at the very basic level, if you ask me. Just not necessarily at the university level, but at the elementary school level. And in many cases, this actually comes from the family as well, just from understanding that the limits of the government and the rights of the people.
I have a methodological question for you. So you do 100,000 interviews in the number of countries that you study. How many of them are conducted within Mexico itself, so that you can determine from that questionnaire, that survey, what the situation of the rule of law is in Mexico? We interview 1,000 people in each one of the countries, lay people, plus about 30 practitioners, lawyers in each one of the countries. In Mexico, indeed, this year we're starting a project to measure each one of the states. So instead just comparing the countries, we want to interview about 25,000 people in the entire country to be able to draw comparisons across the state and compare Guanajuato with Guerrero. Okay. So it doesn't include every single state, and it includes...
No, just the current survey, we do it only in the 3 largest cities.
Right. Yes, we have a question here.
Over lunch, we were talking here at the table about other aspects of the rule of law in Mexico, dealing with the culture at the ground level. We were talking earlier this morning about regulators and government and institutions, but what happens at the ground level when you face the reality of unions not allowing companies to perform work and increasing the cost of operating in a country like Mexico? So what's your perspective on that? What you see being done at that level, if anything?
Just specifically on unions or in general?
In general.
No, that's precisely what the topic of my presentation was precisely that. Just that to look at this perspective, to look at this issue from the perspective of the ordinary citizen or the ordinary businessman. So that's, the ordinary people, what they have to deal is just when they go to try to get a permit, just they have to face corrupt authorities, and if they have an issue with the neighbor, they indeed may or may not go to court, and indeed they may not necessarily have all the information that they require. They are victims of crime. These are particularly the issues that we face, and that's the perspective that we try to put in building these indicators.
I have another question. One of the questions that comes up in various forums and panels that I've attended over months now is the energy reform and the challenges of security and the rule of law in Mexico. And even yesterday in a conversation that we had, we know that the large corporations like BP and Shell and Chevron and so on work in even more difficult conditions in Afghanistan and Pakistan or certainly Iraq and so on, in Africa, under conditions that are much worse than Mexico's, and yet they do it successfully. So in regard to the rule of law and the issue of security, which you covered at the end of your presentation, will these companies be able to navigate it? What is the difference between operating in say, a country like the Central African Republic, or Iraq, or Mexico, which gives the impression of a much more developed economy, much more institutionalized country, and so on, for these companies to operate? And then, what is your impression or the difference between these large corporations that may have the tools and the means, especially the financial means, to deal with the government and local communities and a lack of public safety and security and corruption, and the smaller companies that we know eventually will make their way to Mexico as operators in the shale sector and so on? So how do you break this scenario down?
That's an excellent question, and obviously it's one that is not easy to answer, that has many different dimensions. You're right. Just in general, all companies operate in the worst environments in the world. Essentially, they operate whenever there is oil, that's where they are going to operate. And indeed, what we see is that they have incentives, indeed, in many cases, to operate in authoritarian countries or in these kind of countries. It depends, I think, a lot on the nature of the investment. Just when the investment is simply extracting and just selling it, you're right, just can simply hire private security, you don't need to move a lot of the personnel there, just move resources, just take them out, just sell them to the rest of the world. I think part of the challenge is just whenever you are trying to involve just the larger, much more than just simply extracting the oil. Just when you are, we were listening, for instance, just about gasoline, just in which we're thinking about just the domestic market. Just the situation is completely different if we're thinking just between just a primary investment or primary for investment versus just investment in the tertiary sector. So in that regard, then the security concerns obviously become much more relevant than just simply extracting the resources. I think also dealing with the system, the weak institutions, is slightly different. In weak regimes or in authoritarian regimes, it's to a certain extent easier to deal just with authorities because there are not as many sources of power to actually deal with. So that's a lot of the history that we see of all companies operating in authoritarian and supporting authoritarian regimes in Africa has to do with that. It's just you only deal with one guy, you make a corrupt deal with the guy, and then you extract the resources. So in Mexico, I think the situation is much more complicated because you have the sources of power are much more fragmented. Just the society is much more complicated, and we're not going back to a model of authoritarianism. Just Mexico is a democracy right now and is in that path. So then that is also an issue to take into account.
Last question.
Diana Negroponte, Woodrow Wilson. Alejandro, thank you very much for an objective, analytical, and difficult subject that you faced. So my question's difficult. Would the politicians, the Congress in Mexico, be willing to consider what the Guatemalans have accepted, a United Nations Commission to eradicate corruption at its most senior level, the CICIG?
Well, it's not a tough question for me because I'm not in the Congress. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether they will be willing to. Just my sense is probably that they won't. But yeah.
Okay, let's take about 5 minutes because we need to make our transition to the next room. Thank you very much, Alejandro.
Thank you.
If you need to stretch your legs and get some water, and then make your way in the back room, please.